Welcome to another episode of Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here at the News Forum, where all voices matter. I'm pleased to have back as my guest Tom Caldwell. He's the chairman of Caldwell Securities in Toronto. Economic news is coming in fast and furious these days, so let's get to it. Welcome back, Tom.
Thank you.
I guess the first thing would be to get your reaction to the recent interest rate hikes in the US, the UK, and Canada. What did you think about those?
Well, it's interesting. In our building, the Bank of Canada and the government have offices. So I saw the governor of the Bank of Canada walking through this morning on my way to the office, and I noted what appeared to be a bodyguard with him. So I don't know whether that's necessary or not. The interest rate increases, they're still being aggressive. I kind of feel we're reaching the end of a cycle. These were, except for Canada, these were 75 basis point increases. My guess is the next one might be a quarter. They might ease off. I think they're where they want to be, give or take 50 basis points. And then they have to wait and see what happens because there's tremendous lags to increasing interest rates and monetary policy. They can be 12 to 18 months later. So
Well,
I don't
you've
think
made that point before that it's not instantaneous. You raise interest rates and your problems are solved.
absolutely. So it's going to be a while. I think they're really trying to address psychology with verbiage in the process. If we're going to be tough, we're going to fight this, etc. It's really, I love that determination, given that they were the folks that caused the inflation in the first place. But I digress.
Yeah.
But I think we're reaching the top or near the top. We're near the end and the beginning of this interest rate increase. Because remember, we're coming from near zero.
Right. Now, you did reference that the Bank of Canada did a half a point raise. The Federal Reserve did three-quarters of a point. Should we be worried about that? Does that make a difference at all?
I don't honestly know because we're not going to be out of lockstep with the Americans in this matter because that affects the value of our dollar vis-a-vis the U.S. dollar. So on one hand, we don't want to see a weaker U.S. dollar, a weaker Canadian dollar relative to the U.S. because of an interest rate differential. So we'll be roughly in tune. 25 basis point doesn't make a great deal of difference either way.
Hmm.
I think he wanted to show in Canada that we may be nearing the end of this increase process.
Okay, so that was a signal that because it wasn't three-quarters of a point, that they're perhaps starting to reassess the situation. I guess the bigger issue, and I'm always asking you to look into your crystal ball here, but will these rate hikes stop inflation or risk a recession or both?
Inflation, as over a period of time, will tend to cure itself. People either can't or won't spend higher prices on things. Everybody's trying to push prices down the line, but there'll be a point here when people just won't accept it. So inflation can self-correct to some degree. There are worldly pressures going on here, and there are cost pressures. And it starts a lot in the interest rate, because remember, every bit of groceries, they got to come by truck, they've got to come by diesel. So they're starting this energy transition program with governments fixated on that. It was the genesis of much of the inflation we're now experiencing. Now, other stuff has come along with that, don't get me
Right.
wrong, but it was the start, pushing up your basic cost base. So will it solve the problem? At least to some degree. It may, once the psychology of inflation is in, it takes a long time to water its way down, and it will do it over time. But I hope to gosh we don't have to do a Volcker thing with 18% interest rates, which was devastating to the economy.
It was indeed. I do remember those days. And of course, every time inflation goes up, there's more demands by bargaining agents to match the inflation in their next pay packet. So these things do have these longer term effects, right?
Well, we're seeing that right now. We were seeing unions saying, well, we've got to catch up. And I understand that because it's getting more expensive. Everything is getting more expensive. So there is a catch up to this. Once it starts, it can fuel on itself. Originally, this inflation started on the supply side, energy, supply chains, that
Right.
sort of thing. And then it wasn't excess demand. In higher interest rates really impact excess demand. That is not the kind of inflation we have. I do think to have a solely a monetary policy is like operating without anesthetic. The real demander here is you got governments on the fiscal side
Right.
still spending like they were in the United States and in Canada.
And we're back here at Boom and Bust. I'm your host, Tony Clement, here with our monthly guest, Tom Caldwell. He is chairman of Caldwell Securities in Toronto. Tom, next topic is Finance Minister Freeland's latest economic statement, the fall economic statement. What are your top of mind reaction to that?
Well, it's really the one thing that kind of hit me was the 2% tax on share buybacks.
Right.
That's kind of an evil tax because the general public don't know the ramifications of it and nobody cares. But for example, I'm the CEO of a public company. The share price is way under its asset value by about 40%, 50%. So we buy back shares and cancel them, which benefits the existing shareholders. And we can adjust our cap table that way, buy shares in cheaply and then issue them later if they become more expensive. We're going to have to stop doing that. That will have an impact on share price. So I don't think a lot of these measures, they look as though we're going to raise money here, there, and everywhere, and it doesn't hurt anybody. It does. And I don't think I've seen governments really think of the secondary or tertiary effect of some of their actions. The basic point here is that deficits are still extremely high, inordinately high, and government's still spending money, no matter how they craft it, no matter how they present their case, they are still spending money. So it's as if they haven't got the lesson yet that governments have to be part of the fight on inflation.
Right.
In the US, for example, you got President Biden spending more money, saying it's helping inflation, which maybe I missed that part of Economics 101, but it's kind of strange. I don't think governments and their spending programs have got the basic message. They are an integral part of the problem.
They are part of the economy, and you're quite right that what we saw in the fall economic statement is, yes, some reduction in spending, but that's from the highest amount that was created as a result of COVID spending, not the lower amount pre-COVID. So we're nowhere near where we're spending a lot more as the government of Canada from that 2019 number. Is that correct?
Absolutely. They're using a false baseline, an inflated baseline, and saying, oh, what good kids we are by cutting our spending back from exorbitant to just outlandish.
Yeah. So do you think that this will have any impact on inflation or cost of living then?
Well, it continually adds to the cost of living. The governments also have to borrow money, and they're going to have to borrow money at higher interest rates, and it adds to deficit on a go-forward basis. So I do think it doesn't deal with the problem, but right now we're in the problem, so we have to try to work our way through it. And I think most people now remember inflation is a new thing for many of our politicians now, that they have to now, I think, tread gingerly lest they make the problem even worse. Central banks are doing the heavy lifting, but this was not a central bank that is excess demand issue. It related to other policies of government, whether it be driving energy prices up through the ceiling. And they say, oh, let's tax excess profits. Well, they're making the profits because they're not reinvesting, and they're told not to reinvest in exploration. So we have a whole hodgepodge of policies based on a flawed premise, and it just gets worse and worse. So there's lots of things government can do without causing a lot of pain to improve the situation. But if you're an ideologue locked in a mindset, say climate change, everything has to flow through from that. And that's where part of the genesis of some of this problem.
Right, right. I'm not trying to pick on Chrystia Freeland, but of course, recently she had a little bit of a faux pas talking about how her family cut out their Disney Plus subscription as a way to deal with pressures on their cost of living, and that did not go over too well. Is that part of the problem, that it's just a hard? It's one of two things. Either the government still doesn't know how much people are suffering, or they don't know how to communicate properly that they've got a plan. I don't know whether you want to comment on that.
Well, first off, I don't want to be too condemnatory, because even with my white hair, I've spent a lifetime saying the wrong thing and pulling faux
Yeah,
pas.
yeah,
So,
sure.
so you know, half of my life is saying idiotic things, and the other half is apologizing.
Yeah,
But I don't think there's an empathy. I think in governments. I mean, let me put it this way: most of the senior government people that we have come from very affluent circumstances. And as a consequence, I don't think there's the empathy of that fear level. Can I make the mortgage payment? Can I make the month payment? We're going to have to cut out some of the, they do, everybody's, oh, the public and the Canadian people. This is all rhetoric. They don't, at a gut, empathetic, understanding level,
yeah,
know what it's like to be fearful of your economic situation.
indeed. And we're back here, boom and bust, with our guest, Tom Caldwell, our monthly guest. He's the chairman of Caldwell Securities. Tom, I probably should ask you, you're the expert on this, obviously, but just maybe some commentary on how the markets are reacting either to the fall statement or general economic conditions.
If I had to use a word, I would, for equity markets, I'd say the word resilient. We've had an awful lot of stuff going on, from crackpot government policies to spending to increasing interest rates to geopolitical concerns of war and threats of war and all tons of stuff going on. Now the market's down a little bit this year, but remember it had to let off steam of several very, very robust years. So even a 10% correction doesn't mean a great deal, but the markets have been able to hold in quite a bit despite all the negative stuff that's being built upon and factionalism, etc. So it's quite interesting to me. As you know, I tend to be a little bit optimistic on things, and I'm generally an equity fund manager as opposed to fixed income. But on the equity side, I'm still fairly positively disposed. Where else are you going to put your money to hedge against inflation? You got to put it in stuff, and
Right.
equity are stuff.
No, and I was actually going to make that very point that it seems that despite all the economic headwinds, investors haven't lost their confidence or their cool, have they?
I don't think so. No, but remember, part of it's the structure of markets. There was a study done by J.P. Morgan in 2017 that alluded to about 10% of investors are really interested in fundamental economic corporate developments. The rest are all professional trading environments. So the nature of capital markets have changed. A lot of the retail investors, like most advisors, don't want to cover small accounts because the risks are too high, the costs are too high. So they are do-it-yourselfers who generally have been massacred in the first half of this year. But aside from that, you're seeing a very professional market in some ways muting some of these things. And in some ways it aggravates the volatility. But I do think that it's quite interesting the way markets have behaved through this period of time. And I think we'll probably, and this is my best guess here, I think we'll probably have a good period between now and the year end. This year may
Interesting.
not end up that bad a year.
Yeah, no, that's interesting. Thanks for sharing that for sure. The other side of it, of course, is housing prices. We've seen a little bit of relenting on that front recently, at least in the major markets anyway. Is that sustainable as well?
Well, typically housing prices, they're long cycle. And Canada is unique. We're talking about 500,000 immigrants coming to Canada on a yearly
Right.
basis, whatever. Uh, and Toronto particularly is an immigrant destination because there is an everything community here. No matter where you come from, you can find a support community from your country here in Toronto and other places in Canada, which is a wonderful thing for the country and indeed Toronto. But these people need housing. Some of them come with lots of money. There's lots of money in the world, and so you might end up as a condo here just as an escape valve in case you have to get out of XYZ country. So there's lots of anomalous factors. Also, remember, municipal governments make a lot of money from condos. If you're going to build $100 million condo, the government's going to take 10 or 20 million of that municipal because we're going to add to facilities like maybe a subway in Toronto, probably not. But at any rate, there's a lot of infrastructure, and then I see we've got to freeing up some of the green belt for 1,000, 2,000 houses. That's still a drop in the bucket.
Right.
Increasingly, for example, when my mother bought our first house, or my mother and father, she rented rooms. I mean, that's what people did to pay for houses.
Right.
You took in extra income until you built enough equity in it, kind of thing. So people have to be innovative. You can still buy a house if you're prepared to use your brain and moderate your tastes a little bit.
Indeed, and very interesting advice. You mentioned the Greenbelt announcement of the Ford government here in Ontario. There was also a much larger housing build plan. Are you optimistic that that'll work?
All of it adding to supply is going to help. But in actual fact, in Toronto is sort of self-correcting because it's very difficult commuting in Toronto now. It's insane. I mean, the combination of bike lanes and throw construction on top of that, a lot of people won't come back. I'm seeing it with their own employees, will not come back to work because it's so hard to get in and out of the city. And by the way, the subway is not the answer to that. Similarly, I noticed stores closing downstairs. Other people rent spaces like our company aren't taking on the same space. So the city plan was theoretically everybody's going to work close to their work, walk to their job, or ride their bicycle. Well, this ain't Denmark, so
Yeah.
it's Canada. So what happens is we're by some of the policies, you're going to find people dispersing.
Okay,
on the
hold that thought. We're back here at Boom and Bust with Tom Caldwell, chairman of Caldwell Securities. Sorry, I had to cut you off there. You were just making a
No
point
problem.
about the new housing policies and the basically to build more housing for everyone. So please continue.
Well, as a covering comment, typically by the time governments get involved, the problem is already correcting itself. And that's my basic point, that that's great, go build some more houses or whatever. But for example, I think the condo market in Toronto is probably overbuilt. You're probably seeing a situation now
They're still
where,
building more though. I still see them. The cranes are everywhere.
but there's the lead time. Once you start it and get approval, you're 2 years out. And once you can start building, you might as well start building because you've raised a good chunk of the money and see what comes out of it. But there's different segments to the housing market. I'm very fortunate. I've been very blessed in my life. We live in an old house in Forest Hill. Probably not a month or a week goes by where I don't get an offer on our house, a very robust offer at multiples of what we paid for it many,
Mhm.
many years ago. So there's components to the market, and there's still a lot of money around. Starter houses, listen, we all started with places that we wanted to move from. And so you have to moderate your taste, your location, facilities, whatever, when you start your first home. And as I mentioned earlier, maybe you rent rooms or buy a duplex. It's actually on a per square foot basis, they're cheaper than houses. So you have to just use your brain a little bit. You can get into the housing market if you want to. I don't think there's a rush to do it because I think there will be opportunities here as they come. Because as I say, houses go in long cycles. A house on Warren Road, that was the most expensive in Forest Hill, in 1929 was $250,000. It
Really?
didn't. They didn't get back to $250,000 until the mid '60s. So there was a 35, almost 40-year gap. But after that dip, because you had the war and the depression and everything else in between. So they can go in long cycles. But remember, Canada and Toronto have this immigrant wave that will continue to underpin housing.
Indeed. So what do you see on the economic horizon, given all of those factors, whether it's interest rates or housing costs or immigration levels or fiscal policy? What keeps you up at night, and what gives you some chance for optimism?
What keeps me up at night is really Canada. We have not had any serious economic policies. The problem, I keep saying that the world is divided into power blocks, the East and the West. The East is dominated by tyrants, and the West is dominated by morons. Morons are bad enough, but if you're an ideologue to boot, that is, you have a vision of the world that everybody must fit into that makes you dangerous. And in Canada, our climate change is the number one policy, or peace off people who feel they were aggrieved. Those are the two policies and the only policies. I have not seen anything coming the way to develop a national strategy. What do the industries want to build? Listen, we're an energy powerhouse. How do we build on this with cleaner energy? So I haven't seen policies that are going to help Canada. And we're in competition with other countries. And our biggest competitor is the United States.
Right.
Canada's a great country to start a business. It's not a good country to build a business. I can tell you that. I know what it's like. I work both sides of the border. So that keeps me up at night. No policies here. The positive side is the one advantage of the US is it does self-correct. You have these midterm elections, and maybe the Republicans are a little disappointed they didn't swamp the world but maybe people didn't want to have Trump back. They want to have a more balanced approach to government, but they can renew themselves. And the reason I'm positive on equity markets is, where else are you going to put your money? There are still really good companies out there that are paying good, safe, and growing dividends. That's where I can place my funds. And the economy will roll on. We may slow down a little bit into next year, but I don't see anything at the present time that has me running for the door.
Well, I think you're right about a few things there, including not being a good night, election night with the midterms, not being a good night for Donald Trump, and possibly a very good night for Ron DeSantis. So we'll be
I
watching
think
that.
so.
Yeah, I'll be watching that story
I
very
think that's a
closely.
good thing too, Tony. I think that's probably a good thing.
Yeah.
Get some balance, because otherwise, if Trump backs, we're just going to be fighting with everybody for the next 4
It's going
years
to be
beyond.
the same old battle that was
So,
done 4 years before and 4 years before that. So
so
I tend to agree with you on that. And of course, people look to the United States because of its huge economic power as well as its political influence. Canadians love talking U.S. politics, sometimes more than Canadian politics. Tom Caldwell, that's it for our show today. Thanks for being a part of it. We'll see you next month.
thanks, Tony. All the best. Bye
Thanks.
bye.
Another interesting discussion with our monthly guest, Tom Caldwell, chairman of Caldwell Securities in Toronto, talking about the general economic picture, inflation, interest rates, cost of living, and some of the political factors, including the U.S. midterm elections, the climate change conference. We got into that a little bit as well. So I hope you enjoyed our usual discussion and conversation. We'll see you next time.